After the defeat of Nazi Germany, thousands of former members of the feared Waffen-SS and the SS Totenkopf fled, were captured, or simply reintegrated into civilian life. Some faced trials for war crimes, while others managed to remain undetected for decades. Today, most are elderly people living out their final years in anonymity, with biographies few know and a past many prefer to forget. In this video, we explore what became of their lives after World War II, how they managed to rebuild, and why their legacy remains such an uncomfortable and controversial topic. How do SS men live today? In recent years, only a small handful of centenarians who fought in the Waffen-SS, the elite force of the Third Reich, survive. Of the hundreds of thousands of men who served in its ranks, some convinced fanatics, others mere recruits, only a few remain alive. Most of these survivors are now over 100 years old and live in deliberate anonymity, scattered throughout Europe, North America, and some South American countries that for decades offered refuge to former members of the Nazi apparatus. The Waffen-SS began as Adolf Hitler's personal protection corps and evolved into a military force parallel to the Wehrmacht. Its well-equipped and indoctrinated divisions were responsible for war crimes and atrocities against civilians on the eastern and western fronts. Despite its aura of an elite unit, its ranks were swelled by volunteers and recruits from all over Europe, attracted by propaganda, fanaticism, or the opportunity to escape poverty. One of the best known of these men was Otto Günsche, who served as Adolf Hitler's personal aide. Günsche had direct access to the most decisive moments of the Nazi regime and was an eyewitness to the collapse of the Third Reich. In his final moments, he received a personal order to cremate the Führer's body after his suicide in the Chancellery bunker. Captured by the Red Army in May 1945, he spent more than a decade interned in forced labor camps in the Soviet Union. He did not regain his freedom until 1956. After his return to Germany, he chose to stay away from the media spotlight. He never published memoirs, never gave interviews, and led a discreet existence in a country torn between traumatic memory and the need for reconstruction. He died in 2003 at the age of 86, a silent witness to the tragedy he helped sustain. Another of the last direct witnesses of those final days was Rochus, who served as a bodyguard and telephone operator in Hitler's bunker. Misch was there when the regime collapsed, answering calls as the Soviets bombed Berlin. After Germany's capitulation, he spent 9 years imprisoned in the Soviet Union. Upon returning to Berlin, he established himself as a merchant and opened a small home interiors shop. Until the end of his life, he never showed remorse or self-criticism. He stubbornly defended Hitler and reiterated that for him, he was nothing more than a good leader. He died in 2013 at the age of 96, one of the last survivors who were present at the heart of the Nazi regime as it collapsed. More recently, in May 2023, Erhard Gürs died. He had held the rank of Obersturmführer in the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, considered the most famous and feared unit of the Waffen-SS. Gürs fought in Normandy, the Ardennes, and in the desperate defense of Germany in 1945. At 103 years old, his death marked a symbolic closure, the extinction of the last generation of high-ranking officers who were part of that war machine. His death was received discreetly, almost without public mention, as if society preferred not to stir up the ashes of an all-too uncomfortable past. Today, the last veterans of the Waffen-SS survive with extreme discretion, many carefully concealing their past to avoid the stigma and historical condemnation that continues to weigh on the organization. Some live in nursing homes where no one knows their biography. Others were reabsorbed into civilian life and built professional careers after the war. Over the years, numerous judicial proceedings attempted to bring to trial those who could still be identified as directly responsible for war crimes, but the passage of time, the difficulty of gathering evidence, and the physical deterioration of the accused frustrated many efforts to achieve justice. Their existence, silent and marginal, constitutes the last echo of a dark chapter whose consequences still resonate in the memory of Europe. While the archives are opened and historians reconstruct every detail of the barbarity, those elderly people who in their youth proudly wore the black uniform of the Waffen-SS face their twilight shrouded in a mixture of oblivion, rejection, and historical curiosity. For many, they represent uncomfortable evidence of how an entire generation could succumb to fanaticism and participate actively or passively in the most atrocious crimes of the 20th century. With the imminent fall of the Third Reich in the spring of 1945, the feared Schutzstaffel, the SS, began to collapse irremediably. Some of its most fanatical leaders still harbored illusions that the growing disputes between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union might lead to a political fracture. They hoped this tension would translate into a separate peace agreement with the British or Americans, which would allow a small Nazi state to remain in place that could serve as a counterweight to Stalin. But when it became clear that this possibility was a pipe dream, the priority became erasing all traces of their crimes before the enemy armies arrived. Heinrich Himmler, the supreme commander of the SS, ordered that no concentration camp prisoners should survive to tell what had happened. Thus began the infamous death marches. Endless columns of exhausted men, women, and children forced to walk across frozen landscapes without food or warm clothing. These marches not only increased the death toll dramatically, but also demonstrated the extent to which the regime held human life in contempt, even in its final days. A similar fate befell prisoners in the Gestapo and Kripo, criminal police prisons. On May 6, 1945, with Germany's defeat already a certainty, Karl Dönitz, Hitler's appointed successor, dismissed Himmler. Although Himmler had promised to take responsibility for the actions of the SS, he ended up committing suicide a few days later, like so many other Nazi leaders who could not bear the thought of being captured. Many of his subordinates followed suit. Others were arrested by the Allies or managed to escape, especially to South America, thanks to clandestine networks known as ratlines. After Himmler's fall, Ernst Kaltenbrunner took his place as head of the Reich Security Main Office and represented the SS at the Nuremberg trials. By then, the Waffen-SS soldiers were completely left to their own devices. They knew that if captured, their survival was more than uncertain. With railways destroyed, roads impassable, and bridges reduced to rubble, many had to make their way back on foot, crossing frozen rivers and ruined villages with the only hope of reaching home, if their homes still existed. Some dreamed of reuniting with their families far from the front. Others simply wanted to avoid falling into Soviet hands, as the Red Army had a reputation for being far more ruthless than the Western Allies. Indeed, many German soldiers preferred to surrender to the British or Americans, knowing they would generally be taken prisoner rather than executed on the spot. However, not all Allies showed mercy. The rage accumulated over years of war led many Allied soldiers to become impromptu executioners. The Canadian forces, hardened by the fighting in Normandy, were especially feared. The SS knew that if they surrendered to them, they would most likely be shot without trial. The French and Poles inspired the same terror. In the East, the Soviets were ruthless. Some entire Waffen-SS divisions that attempted to surrender were immediately annihilated. The few who survived ended up in forced labor camps where conditions amounted to a slow death. Unlike the British and Americans, the Soviets offered neither trials nor guarantees. Capture was the prelude to brutal interrogations and exemplary punishments. To avoid recognition, many SS members resorted to desperate tricks. The blood tattoo under the left arm, which identified SS members, was unequivocal proof of their membership. The Americans marched the prisoners of war in single file, bare-chested and with arms raised. Those bearing this mark were singled out, interrogated, and, depending on their rank and seniority, sent to prisoner of war camps or executed on the spot. Some tried to erase the tattoo with chemical burns, cuts, or makeup, although they rarely succeeded in fooling the Allied officers. After the surrender, the fate of each SS member depended largely on chance and the disposition of their captor. Those who had joined after 1943 as forced recruits, or young men barely in their teens, were sometimes pardoned. Officers and veterans, on the other hand, almost never escaped imprisonment or death. The Allied punishment system was chaotic, unequal, and often brutal. Even today, almost 80 years later, many SS members remain officially missing, their bodies unfound, their names changed or erased from the records, refugees in distant countries under new identities. Others were tried and executed, and a few managed to die of old age hidden in anonymity. The collapse of the SS was as violent and disorderly as its emergence. And in the final days of the Third Reich, its decomposition was not only military, it was also moral. That organization that had fueled terror and violence until its last breath ended up collapsing under the weight of its own crimes, leaving a legacy of horror that history has never ceased to remember or condemn. A total of 74 SS members were formally accused of committing war crimes, including the particularly notorious cases of Joachim Peiper and Josef Sepietrich, whose activities were recorded in numerous military reports and survivor testimonies. After being identified as members of units involved in atrocities, these men were captured by American troops and taken to a detention center in Schwäbisch Hall, Germany. There, highly specialized teams of interrogators were formed, many of them European refugees who spoke German fluently and had experienced Nazi persecution firsthand. Their linguistic skills and intimate knowledge of the German system of repression proved instrumental in unmasking the accused. Although each prisoner was held in different facilities, in almost all cases they were kept close to other comrades, allowing them to exchange information, coordinate their accounts, and carefully plan their defense strategies before the military tribunals. During interrogations, they testified under oath, hoping that the evidence and testimony of the victims, civilians who had witnessed massacres, prisoners who managed to survive the concentration camps, populations whose cities had been razed, would not be enough to convict them. Nevertheless, the trial brought together nearly 100 witnesses who provided harrowing accounts, including direct confessions and specific accusations against several of the defendants. Unlike some subsequent trials, few of the defendants agreed to testify in their own defense, fearful of further incriminating themselves. During the hearings, they were brought in wearing prison uniforms with large numbered cards hanging around their necks, in an effort to single them out for the court and the press. What happened during those years has become the subject of in-depth historical study. Both the preliminary interrogations and the public trials received intense media attention. German society and international opinion became polarized. For many, this was an act of justice that could not be postponed. For others, a victorious imposition cloaked in legality. As the trials progressed, several defendants denounced alleged illegitimate methods of pressure, even claiming that confessions had been extracted under threat or physical and psychological torture. During the first post-war years, the Allies resolutely promoted denazification policies, which sought to eradicate all influence of the Nazi regime. Along with this, processes of decentralization of power, the democratization of public institutions, and the demilitarization of German society were implemented. For Western powers, especially the United States and the United Kingdom, these measures symbolized an example of how to rebuild a defeated country on new democratic foundations. However, with the outbreak of the Cold War and the growing fear of Soviet communism, this vision began to transform. The priority of containing the Eastern Bloc led to a reconsideration of some of the strictest policies against former German military personnel. The rise of HIAG, the Waffen-SS Veterans Association. Beginning in 1950, with the Korean War in full swing and the risk of Soviet expansion into Europe, US commanders began to see the need to rearm West Germany. In this context, former Wehrmacht officers seized the political moment to push for its public and legal rehabilitation. That same year, they drafted the Himmerod Memorandum, a document proposing not only the reconstruction of a German army, but also the release of those convicted of war crimes and an end to the smear campaign that they claimed was directed against all soldiers without distinction. Pressure from the government of the newly created Federal Republic of Germany forced the Allies to review some cases, commute sentences, and soften the line on denazification. In 1951, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, issued a statement proposing a clear distinction between regular Wehrmacht soldiers and the narrower circle of war criminals directly associated with Hitler and the SS. This distinction sought to allow those who had not played an active role in crimes to be reintegrated into society while maintaining the stigma attached to those primarily responsible. That same year, some former regular army officers were able to regain their military pensions. In contrast, former members of the Waffen-SS continued to be considered part of a criminal organization under the Nuremberg verdict and were therefore excluded from any formal benefits or rehabilitation. A significant development occurred in 1949 when the ban on forming veterans associations was lifted. Within this framework, the HIAG, the Mutual Aid Association of former members of the SS, was born. Its first spokesperson was Paul Hauser, one of the highest-ranking commanders of the Waffen-SS during the war. He was joined by other prominent figures, such as Felix Steiner and Herbert Gieler, who spent years publicly defending the memory of their former organization. The HIAG aimed to cleanse the reputation of the Waffen-SS, presenting it as a purely military force, separate from the crimes of Nazism, an argument that found some resonance in post-war Germany, eager to move on. However, this narrative was consistently contested by historians, Jewish organizations, and victims who insistently pointed out that the Waffen-SS had often been direct instruments of Nazi terror. The debate over their collective responsibility and the legitimacy of the judicial proceedings that convicted them has not disappeared. To this day, it remains a controversial issue, fraught with political and moral tensions that demonstrate the extent to which the wounds of the past remain raw. After regaining their freedom in 1954 and 1955, respectively, Kurt Meyer and Josef Sapietrich became active members of HIAG, the influential association of former Waffen-SS soldiers. Over the years, Meyer, who had been one of the best-known SS commanders during the war, established himself as one of the organization's most charismatic and recognized spokesmen. As the 1950s progressed, New figures joined HIAG. Prominent among them was Erich Eberhardt, a veteran of the 3rd SS Panzergrenadier Division Totenkopf, who assumed its leadership in 1961 after Mayer's death. Later in 1977, the leadership fell to Wilhelm Bittrich, former commander of the SS Cavalry Division Florian Geyer, whose stature contributed to the association's greater visibility. The HIAG offered shelter and moral support to numerous convicted war criminals whom it presented as victims of victorious justice. In this environment, controversial figures such as Walter Rieder, directly responsible for the Vinca and Marzabotto massacres in Italy, and Herbert Kappler, implicated in the Ardeatine Caves massacre, were welcomed and publicly defended by the organization. The HIAG's official ideology was proclaimed under the motto of a supposed patriotic and European spirit, according to its internal publications. However, as early as 1951, the appearance of its first magazine, Viking Ruf, sparked a wave of rejection and controversy in German public opinion. Many media outlets and associations accused the HIAG of serving as a refuge for Nazi nostalgics and of disseminating a revisionist discourse. In response, Paul Hauser, the organization's first spokesperson, sent a letter to the Bundestag, the German federal parliament, in which he strongly denied the accusations. He argued that the HIAG was nothing more than a social welfare association whose main objective was to assist former soldiers who, according to him, had fought with honor. The organization's statutes detailed purposes such as providing camaraderie, offering legal and financial support to veterans and their families, assisting in locating missing persons, and providing support to those still imprisoned in Allied prisoner of war camps. One of the HIAG's central demands was the recognition of Waffen-SS veterans as public servants, as stipulated in Article 131 of the Basic Law for the Federal Republic of Germany. They thus sought the same pensions and rights as former Wehrmacht soldiers. To justify their demands, they argued that the Waffen-SS constituted the fourth branch of the German armed forces. However, the authorities knew this theory was untenable. The Waffen-SS reported directly to the Nazi Party and the SS, and its involvement in countless war crimes and the surveillance of concentration camps was widely documented. Despite this, the HIAG managed to attract sympathy thanks to its social aid networks and the establishment of a tracing service that investigated the fate of more than 40,000 missing Waffen-SS members. These humanitarian assistance initiatives helped soften public perceptions of the association and present it as an organization with legitimate aims. In 1952, the HIAG held its first major mass event in the city of Verden, where speeches extolling freedom, order, and justice were delivered. However, the intervention of Hermann Bernhard Ramke, a former paratrooper general convicted of war crimes, thwarted any attempt to present a respectable image. Ramke went so far as to vehemently assert that the true war criminals were the Allies, and that the blacklist of former SS members would eventually be remembered as an honor roll. His words caused an immediate stir inside and outside Germany. The American press picked up the news with headlines such as "Hitler's Guard applauds former chief" and "Agitator General worries Allies." Images were broadcast of the public cheering Ramko and chanting insults at Eisenhower, whom they called a pig and a dog. Although the HIAG leadership tried to distance itself from these demonstrations, the controversy intensified. From then on, the organization used popular outrage as a rhetorical argument, insisting that its members were ordinary soldiers and that those who remained imprisoned deserved the same treatment as any POW. Like other veterans associations, the HIAG called for a general amnesty and the release of all those convicted of war crimes. This debate became a central issue in post-war politics to the point that the German government was receptive and promised to explore possible avenues for prison release. During the second half of the 1950s, the HIAG consolidated its political influence. It managed to establish contacts with the Christian Democratic Union, the ruling party, and also with sectors of the social democratic opposition, leveraging these ties to strengthen its institutional legitimacy and expand its membership base. However, its public behavior continued to fuel controversy. The organization remained committed to praising the Waffen-SS's past and honoring the memory of those condemned. In 1953, for example, the HIAG celebrated the winter solstice, the pagan festival that Hitler promoted as an alternative to the Christian Christmas. During the ceremony, hundreds of supporters marched to Stauffeneck Castle in Bavaria, chanting, "This is the guard that Adolf Hitler loves." The following year, at a convention in Göttingen, the HIAG faced harsh criticism from the Jewish Council, university associations, and the academic administration itself, which denounced its revisionist and apologetic attitude. Beginning in 1954, the organization began organizing memorial services for executed war criminals, gathering annually at the Amelinghausen Cemetery, which became a site of symbolic pilgrimage. By the late 1950s, these gatherings drew over 15,000 people, especially during the anniversaries of figures such as Bernhard Siebken, former commander of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, thus consolidating the HIAG as the main focus of nostalgia for the Third Reich in post-war Germany. In one of the most controversial episodes of its history, the HIAG attempted to insert an obituary in the prestigious Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung newspaper with the aim of praising Max Simon, an SS Gruppenführer who had been one of the most responsible for the Marzabotto massacre, in which hundreds of Italian civilians were murdered. The newspaper's management categorically refused to publish the tribute, a refusal that unleashed the indignation and fury of the organization's leaders, who publicly denounced what they considered intolerable censorship. During the Nuremberg trials, almost all the former Waffen-SS officers who appeared as witnesses or defendants insisted on presenting their organization as a simple military force, comparable in all respects to the Wehrmacht. They argued that its sole purpose had been to fight in the service of Germany, with no political or criminal implications. However, the International Tribunal flatly rejected this defense. The Nuremberg verdict was clear. The Waffen-SS was part of a criminal organization and structurally implicated in crimes against humanity. The HIAG spent decades trying to overturn that conviction. It launched propaganda campaigns, published publications, and organized events seeking to rewrite the collective memory, spreading a narrative that justified its past and denied the atrocities. Despite the growing controversy surrounding the HIAG, there were prominent figures who viewed it with a degree of sympathy. For example, in 1953, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer himself declared that former Waffen-SS soldiers should not be distinguished from other German combatants, given that many of them had been conscripted. These words offered the organization moral support, which it sought to exploit to gain legitimacy. Meanwhile, the HIAG redoubled its efforts to impose its revisionist vision of history. He edited magazines, funded book publications, and organized speeches in which he denied the criminal nature of the SS and justified the brutality of the Nazi regime. Over time, these activities became the focus of attention of numerous historians and sociologists who in their research pointed out the anti-democratic and anti-Semitic nature of his views. His critics denounced the complete lack of repentance among its members and their determination to prolong National Socialist ideology among veterans and their sympathizers. As the decades passed, the HIAG gradually lost influence and public presence. Its discourse increasingly aroused less understanding and more rejection. Finally, in 1992, the organization was finally dissolved, although its legacy lived on in various denialist movements. Ella Stille Hilfe, between charity and Nazi revisionism. As the HIAG crumbled, another figure linked to the SS world continued to attract media attention. Gudrun Himmler, the only daughter of Heinrich Himmler and Margareta Boden. Born on August 8, 1929 in Munich, Gudrun grew up in an environment marked by absolute loyalty to Hitler. Her father, one of the most responsible for the Holocaust, affectionately called her Puppi, which means little doll in German. The family's complicity was reflected in a testimony she wrote after visiting the Dachau concentration camp when she was just a child. Today we walked around the concentration camp. Dad showed me where the lettuce and cereals grew. Afterward, we saw the paintings the prisoners had painted. They were all very beautiful. At the end, we had a very good lunch. With the defeat of the Third Reich and her father's suicide in 1945, Gudrun was marked by an unwavering pride in Nazi ideology. In various public interviews, she denied the existence of systematic extermination in the concentration camps and expressed her desire to restore her father's image. In fact, in 1959, she declared, "My father is seen today as the greatest genocidaire in history. I want to try to change that image." For years, Gudrun held a position in the West German Foreign Intelligence Service, where she worked until 1968. But even earlier, in 1951, she had been associated with Stille Hilfe, silent aid for prisoners of war and detainees, a clandestine support network for former SS members. Stille Hilfe was founded by Princess Helene Elisabeth von Isenburg, who, even before formally creating the organization, had been dedicated to providing logistical support to Nazi fugitives. The princess and her collaborators facilitated the escape of war criminals to South America, primarily Argentina, to avoid prosecution in international tribunals. Among the beneficiaries of this network were infamous names such as Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, Walter Rauff, and Johann von Leers. Impressed by the effectiveness of these clandestine rescue operations, its promoters decided to institutionalize the initiative and create a non-profit association to channel donations. On October 7, 1951, a group of supporters met in Munich, and a few weeks later, on November 15th, they officially registered the organization in the Bavarian town of Wolfratshausen. According to its founder, Stille Hilfe's primary objective was to protect the human rights of prisoners of war and convicts whom she believed lacked basic guarantees. However, in practice, its main purpose was to keep alive the memory of the Nazi cause and support those guilty of crimes against humanity. From its earliest years, Stille Hilfe focused on financing the legal defense of the accused. Lawyer Rudolf Aschenauer coordinated the legal representation of numerous defendants while the organization raised funds to pay subsidies, salaries, and bonuses to prisoners and their families. Helene von Isenburg cultivated a very close relationship with the Catholic Church and Pope Pius XII. This closeness allowed German bishops to offer financial and moral support to the organization. In some cases, this was a genuine desire for national reconciliation rather than ideological affinity. For example, Bishop Johannes Neuhäusler, who had been imprisoned at Dachau and tortured by the SS, expressed his desire to return good for evil. Nevertheless, the Church maintained its support for Stille Hilfe, even when it called for the release of some of the worst war criminals. Over the decades, the organization continued to be involved in cases that generated enormous scandal. Among the beneficiaries of their campaigns was Hildegard Leckert, nicknamed the Bloody Witch of Majdanek, famous for the sadism with which she tortured prisoners. Her example symbolized the true nature of Stille Hilfe. More than a humanitarian organization, it was a bastion of denialism, revisionism, and defense of Nazism under the guise of social aid. Stille Hilfe, the network that provided support to former Nazis and collaborators of the Third Reich, not only reached out to war criminals such as Walter Raeder and Herbert Kappler. It was also actively involved in providing legal and financial assistance to other equally sinister figures, such as Klaus Barbie, nicknamed the Butcher of Lyon, Erich Priebke, responsible for the Ardeatine Caves massacre, and Josef Schwamberger, commandant of several labor camps in Poland. In 1959, the organization's founder, Helene Elisabeth von Eisenberg, stepped down from her position as president and handed over leadership to Gertrude de Heer and Adelheg, who maintained a staunch defense of their former SS comrades. Decades later, in 1992, the presidency passed to Horst Janssen, under whose leadership the association continued to collaborate with self-identified political prisoners and with those sympathetic to historical revisionism. Meanwhile, many Waffen-SS veterans and other former members of the Nazi regime were reintegrating into post-war German society. Among them was Rochus Misch, who, unlike others, achieved public notoriety for having been part of Hitler's inner circle. Rochus Misch was born on July 29, 1917, in Alt-Schalkowitz, a town in the province of Silesia, which at that time belonged to the Kingdom of Prussia within the German Empire. From childhood, his life was marked by tragedy. His father, a construction worker, lost his life fighting in the First World War. Just a few years later, his mother died of pneumonia when he was just 2.5 years old. After being orphaned, his maternal grandfather took charge of his upbringing. Misfortune struck the family again in 1922, when his brother Bruno drowned while swimming. His grandfather, who valued manual labor above all else, decided to remove Rochus from school at the age of 8. Convinced that the boy needed to learn a trade as soon as possible, he interrupted his formal education. During his adolescence, Rochus moved to Hoyerswerda, Saxony, where he began an apprenticeship at the Schmüri model firm, which specialized in decorative painting. There he began to carve out a future for himself as a poster and sign painter. His artistic talent led him in 1935 to enroll at the School of Fine Arts in Cologne, where he remained for a few months before returning to Hoyerswerda to continue his practical training. In 1938, during a period of rest, he met Gerda, the woman who would become his wife. They married on New Year's Eve 1942 in the midst of the war, and later had a daughter whom they named Brigitte. Rochus's career took a decisive turn in 1937 when he was called up for military service. Shortly thereafter, he joined the SS Verfügungstruppe, which preceded the formation of the Waffen-SS. His performance led to his selection to join the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the elite unit that served as the Führer's personal escort. In 1939, at just 22 years old, he was promoted to the rank of SS Rottenführer. During the invasion of Poland, he and his regiment participated in operations of the 13th Army Corps, attached to the German 8th Army. On September 24, 1939, his commander, SS Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Mohnke, selected him as part of a small group of 5 men tasked with negotiating the surrender of the Polish troops entrenched in Modlin. Misch, who spoke rudimentary Polish, was unable to persuade the defenders. The mission failed, and in the violent clash that followed, he was knocked unconscious by an exploding shell. The impact was so severe that he had to temporarily withdraw from the front and spend 6 weeks in a convalescent home. His conduct during the campaign earned him the Iron Cross, second class, a recognition he was awarded upon his recovery. After his convalescence, Mohnke decided to transfer him to the Begleitkommando des Führers, Hitler's closest security detail, made up of selected members of the SS and the Leibstandarte who, for various reasons, were not considered fit to return to frontline combat. From that moment on, Misch accompanied Hitler on numerous official trips and trips to headquarters. As a bodyguard, he had the privilege, shared by very few men, of carrying weapons in the dictator's presence. He also performed auxiliary functions, acting as a telephone operator, messenger, orderly, driver, and occasionally waiter. In early January 1945, after the German defeat in the Battle of the Bulge, Misch was sent, along with the rest of Hitler's closest personnel, to the Reich Chancellery bunker in Berlin. There he assumed the role of primary telephone operator, responsible for maintaining the Führer's direct communications with the outside world as the Third Reich collapsed. On April 22nd, her commander, Franz Schadler, informed her that he had secured plane tickets to evacuate his wife and daughter out of Berlin. However, Gerda decided to reject the offer and remain in the city, taking refuge with her parents as the fighting intensified. Misch was an eyewitness to the final moments of the Nazi regime. He heard the shots that marked the suicide of Hitler and Eva Braun, and was one of the first to behold their bodies. He was also present the day Magda and Josef Goebbels poisoned their 6 children and took their own lives. On May 2nd, 1945, just hours before the official surrender of Berlin, Rochus Misch fled the bunker intending to reach the Western lines. However, he was captured by Red Army troops and taken to Moscow, where he was interned in the dreaded Lubyanka prison. He remained there until the end of 1953, becoming a prisoner of high propaganda value for the Soviets. After his release, Misch returned to Germany and led a discreet life, although as time went by, he began to give interviews in which he recounted his experience with Hitler. He always expressed pride in his role and asserted that, although he disagreed with certain political decisions, he never felt ashamed of having been part of the Führer's inner circle. After regaining his freedom, Rochus Misch returned to Berlin, immersed in a deep sense of disorientation. The passage of almost a decade of captivity and the psychological aftermath of the collapse of the Third Reich left him unable to find a clear meaning in his existence. For a time, he tried his hand at odd jobs, carrying suitcases at a hospital, working shifts as a delivery driver, and performing other temporary jobs. However, many of these jobs required him to relocate to central Berlin. His wife Gerda was categorically opposed to this idea, as she was satisfied with her teaching position in Neukölln and refused to abandon her stability. Finally, Misch's fortunes changed when a group of German philanthropists granted him a loan, which he used to open a shop selling paints, varnishes, and interior decoration materials. This business, which he managed with discipline, allowed him to rebuild a more stable life and leave the precarious jobs behind. His shop operated until 1985, when he decided to retire for good at the age of 68. Despite the passage of time and the collapse of Nazi Germany, Misch never repudiated the figure of Adolf Hitler. In interviews given in the final decades of his life, he insisted on describing the dictator not as a monster, but as an ordinary man who was, in his words, an excellent leader. His unwavering loyalty generated deep tensions within his own family. The greatest of all arose when his daughter Brigitte discovered that her mother had Jewish roots on her maternal side. Brigitte, committed to supporting causes linked to the memory of the Holocaust, was devastated to discover that her father refused to accept this fact and showed no sign of remorse for his past. On September 5, 2013, Rochus Misch died in Berlin at the age of 96, one of the last eyewitnesses to Hitler's final days in the bunker. The Last Men of the SS. Life in the Shadow of the Past. Otto Günsche was born on September 24, 1917 in Jena, then part of the state of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, during the final stages of the German Empire. From a young age, he was drawn to the National Socialist ideology. After finishing secondary school, he volunteered for the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Führer's personal bodyguard regiment, in 1934, and that same year formally joined the Nazi Party. Between 1940 and 1941, Günsche served as Hitler's personal adjutant, a post he briefly interrupted to complete his training at the SS Officers' Academy. Shortly thereafter, he went to the Eastern Front, where he commanded a company of Panzer Grenadiers attached to the Leibstandarte. However, his fate was closely tied to Hitler's inner circle. In 1943, he was again called upon to serve as the Führer's personal adjutant. He was also part of the Führerbegleitkommando, a select unit composed of just 8 men charged with protecting the dictator's life. In April 1945, when Soviet troops stormed into Berlin, Hitler entrusted Günsche with the mission of cremating his body to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. On April 30th, towards the end of the afternoon, Günsche remained on guard outside the door of the underground office where Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Along with Martin Bormann and Heinz Linger, he entered the room to certify the deaths and immediately communicated the news to Josef Goebbels, as well as to Generals Hans Krebs and Wilhelm Burgdorf. He then arranged for the furniture to be removed, laid blankets on the floor, and wrapped the couple's bodies. Through the emergency exit, they were taken to the garden of the Reich Chancellery, where Günsche personally supervised the cremation. After carrying out the order, he attempted to flee the city. But in the early hours of May 1st, he was captured by Soviet soldiers. For years, he became a key element of the NKVD interrogations, which sought to clarify not only the exact circumstances of Hitler's death, but also the hypothesis that he had used a body double. Repeatedly refusing to cooperate, Günsche was subjected to severe mistreatment and torture. In 1955, after serving his sentence in a Sverdlovsk prison camp, he was transferred to Bautzen in the German Democratic Republic. Even after his release, he continued to be persistently interrogated by the Western Allies, who included his testimony in trials and investigations into the end of the Third Reich. Throughout his life, Günsche steadfastly maintained that he had only seen Hitler's body when he was already lying on the couch. This version contrasted with the statements of Arthur Axmann, leader of the Hitler Youth, and Traudl Junge, Hitler's personal secretary, who maintained that Günsche was the one who told them that Hitler had shot himself in the mouth. He always denied this claim and claimed that the dictator shot himself in the right temple. Günsche died in 2003 of cardiac arrest at his residence in Lohmar in North Rhine-Westphalia. Finally, Karl Hauser was born on December 11, 1911, in Preußisch Oldendorf, in the province of Westphalia, when Germany was still part of the German Empire. In his early working years, he worked as a clerk in a bank in Lübeck, but soon became frustrated by the monotonous routine and sense of futility of that position. Convinced that his life should be directed toward a more transcendent purpose, he resigned without looking back and began searching for a path he considered worthy of his ambition and time. After spending more than 2 years without stable employment, Karl Hocker decided to join the SS in 1933, hoping to find a professional opportunity that would provide him with financial security and a sense of purpose within the new political order that was consolidating in Germany. By 1937, he had also joined the Nazi Party, reinforcing his commitment to the regime's ideology. When war broke out in 1939, Höcke was assigned to the 9th SS Infantry Regiment based in Danzig, where he began his career in repressive structures. His promotion was rapid. In 1940, he was appointed direct aide to Martin Weiss, who served as commandant of the Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg. In 1942, Weiss was ordered to move to the Arbeitsdorf camp in Wolfsburg, which had been established as an SS industrial experiment. Höcke, now his trusted confidant, joined him to continue performing administrative duties. When Weiss was reassigned again, this time to the Majdanek concentration camp in Lublin, Poland, Höcke decided not to accompany him immediately. and instead opted to further his military training at the SS Academy in Braunschweig. Upon completing his studies, he rejoined SS operations during Operation Reinhard, the extermination campaign aimed at annihilating the Jewish population of the General Government of Poland. During this period, his duties involved the logistics of deportations and the administrative support of the mass murder machine. In May 1944, Hocker was assigned as deputy to Richard Baer, the new commandant of the Auschwitz complex, which included both the main camp and the Birkenau extermination center. Both officers remained in charge of the site's administration until January 1945, when the advancing Red Army forced the camp's evacuation. They were later relocated to the Dora Mittelbau camp, where they continued organizing the exploitation of thousands of prisoners in the production of weapons, particularly V-2 rockets. Realizing that German defeat was a matter of weeks away, Baer adopted a false identity and went into hiding to avoid immediate capture. Instead, Hocker was arrested by Allied troops and spent about a year in a POW camp. Finally, in 1946, he was released without facing formal charges and was able to return to his family. He resumed his job as a bank clerk, the same position he had held before the war. For nearly 2 decades, he managed to keep his past secret. However, in the early 1960s, judicial authorities in the Federal Republic of Germany reactivated investigations into former SS members who had held positions of responsibility at Auschwitz. It was then that Hocker was located and arrested. The trial took place in Frankfurt as part of a series of trials known as the Second Auschwitz Trial. During the hearings, Hocker denied any direct involvement in the selection of deportees arriving at Birkenau. He argued that his work consisted exclusively of administrative duties and that he lacked both the authority and the will to influence the crimes being perpetrated at the camp. He stated in court, "I only knew about what was happening at Birkenau indirectly during my time there. I had nothing to do with those events. I did not hurt or kill anyone at Auschwitz." Despite his persistent defense, the court found it proven that Hocker had used violence and contributed to sustaining a criminal system that caused the deaths of at least 1,000 people. The prosecution failed to prove that he personally participated in executions, but it did prove that he had detailed knowledge of the camp's genocidal activities and collaborated in its operation. He was ultimately sentenced to 7 years in prison for complicity in mass murder. Hocker was released in 1970 after serving his sentence. Surprisingly, he regained his former position at the bank, where he eventually served as chief cashier. His case was one of the most representative examples of how many former SS officers managed to reintegrate into civilian life without major obstacles, even after being convicted. During his lifetime, he vehemently denied having been present at the ramp where the selections took place. No survivor could identify him with complete certainty as one of the officers who chose who would be killed immediately and who would be deemed suitable for forced labor. However, the story Hocker defended until the end of his life faltered after his death. He died in 2000, but in 2006 the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum acquired a photo album he had compiled. The images portrayed SS officers at Auschwitz during breaks, social gatherings, and excursions to the camp. Among those photographed was the infamous Josef Mengele, known for his inhumane experiments on prisoners. The following year, a team of historians and technicians meticulously analyzed the photographs, paying particular attention to an image taken on the ramp. The image of a man with physical characteristics identical to Hocker, the shape of his skull, the length of his arms, and his build, sparked intense debate. After anatomical comparison studies and a 3D scan, most experts concluded that it was likely him. However, the controversy persisted. The uniform he was wearing in the image corresponded to the rank of SS Oberscharführer, a rank lower than that of SS Obersturmführer, which Höcker officially held at that time. This detail fueled doubt, and to this day, uncertainty persists as to whether the man in the photograph was indeed him. Friedrich Peter was born on July 13, 1921, in the Austrian town of Attnang-Puchheim, in the Vöcklerbruck district of Upper Austria. His biography also bears witness to the way in which former members of the Waffen-SS managed to reintegrate into politics and public life after the collapse of the Third Reich. Friedrich Peter was born in Austria, the son of Aloisia and Friedrich Johann Peter, a train driver with staunch social democratic convictions. At the end of 1938, at just 17 years old, Peter joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP. During World War II, he served as an SS Obersturmführer, first lieutenant, in the 10th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Brigade of the Waffen-SS, actively participating in combat on both the Eastern and Western fronts. In 1941, he was assigned to a unit of Einsatzgruppe C, one of the mobile extermination squads operating in the occupied Soviet Union. During that year, he is credited with participating in the execution of at least 17,000 Jews and 25,000 Soviet prisoners of war. That same year, he received the Iron Cross Second Class, a Nazi military decoration. At the end of the war, Peter was captured and interned by the Americans in the Marcus Dubabe prison camp in Oregon. By now, it was public knowledge that Einsatzgruppen units had been involved in systematic massacres, so the Allies were aware of the nature of their crimes. However, Peter denied any involvement in these acts, asserting that he not only had not participated in, but also had no knowledge of, the crimes. For many historians, such a claim is untenable, considering his senior position within the SS. After his release, Peter managed to reintegrate into civilian life. He worked as a primary and special school teacher and was later appointed principal. Between 1950 and 1970, he also served as editor of the magazine of the Austrian Teachers' Association. In 1968, he was appointed State Inspector of Schools in Upper Austria, responsible for overseeing the functioning of the education system in the region. In the political arena, Peter found a new platform in the Freedom Party of Austria, FPOE. Between 1962 and 1963, as the party's leader, he began negotiations with the Social Democratic Party of Austria, SPO, in an attempt to present the FPO as a more liberal political force. In 1964, Peter declared that both nationalists and liberals had a place within the party. This strategy, however, generated strong internal opposition, so Peter opted to expel those who opposed his reformist line. During the 1970 election campaign, he asserted that there would be no Red Chancellor, referring to the SPO. However, after the elections, he tolerated the minority government led by Bruno Kreisky, a Social Democrat leader and victim of the Nazi regime. In return, Kreisky pushed through electoral reform that greatly benefited the FPO. In 1974, Peter was appointed to the board of directors of the ORF, the body that regulated public broadcasting in Austria. However, a year later, in 1975, the prestigious Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, director of the Jewish Documentation Center in Vienna, published a report revealing Peter's past as an SS Obersturmführer and involvement in mass murder. Paradoxically, Kreisky, who had suffered Nazi persecution, publicly defended Peter and accused Wiesenthal of acting with mafia methods and even collaborating with the Gestapo, generating intense national and international controversy. Following the scandal in 1978, Peter decided not to run for the presidency of the FPO, although he continued to wield power and influence from the shadows. Finally, in 1992, he retired from politics permanently after clashing with Jörg Haider, the party's youth leader at the time, Haider had made public statements praising the Third Reich's employment policy, which Peter considered shameful and dangerous. It was then that, breaking his long silence, Peter issued a statement reminding the FPO leaders of their ethical and political duties, condemning open revisionism. Finally, on September 25, 2005, Friedrich Peter died at Hanusch Hospital in Vienna due to a serious kidney disease. Helmut Oberlander was born on February 15, 1924, in the city of Halberstadt, located in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic within the Soviet Union. Due to his German ancestry, in 1941, when he was just 17 years old, he was recruited into Sonderkommando A, a unit that was part of Einsatzgruppe D, dedicated to extermination operations in occupied Soviet territory. As the months passed, Oberlander joined the Sicherheitsdienst, SS intelligence service, and the Sicherheitspolizei, the regime's security police. After the war in 1954, he emigrated to Canada with his wife Margaret, settling in the city of Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. There, he prospered as a businessman in the construction sector. In 1960, he obtained Canadian citizenship. In 1963, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Security Service opened a secret file on Oberlander. Later in 1970, a group of war crimes investigators from West Germany interrogated him. Before them, he denied knowing about the Sonderkommando or any knowledge of mass executions of Jews committed by his unit. His case was classified by the Commission of Inquiry into War Criminals as part of a group of 28 files deemed to be of the utmost importance, given the seriousness of the accusations and the availability of information. Finally, Oberlander admitted to having been part of Sonderkommando 10A, although he claimed that his duties were limited to translating Russian radio transmissions and acting as an interpreter between soldiers and the local population. He added that he also had to guard military officers and perform routine tasks such as protecting supplies or cleaning shoes. However, the Federal Court of Canada rejected this version, noting that his unit was part of the mobile annihilation squads responsible for the murder of more than 2 million people, mostly Jews. The ruling established that Oberlander was an active member of the Sonderkommando between 1941 and 1943, and that, despite his claims, his membership made him complicit in its crimes. From 1943 to 1944, he served as an infantryman in the German army. In 1986, the Commission of Inquiry into War Criminals recommended that the Canadian government prosecute the accused or, alternatively, strip them of their citizenship and deport them for having concealed their past upon emigrating. Therefore, it was determined that Oberlander should not have entered Canada and that his naturalization should be revoked. In April 1995, the Canadian government initiated formal denaturalization and deportation proceedings. Upon learning of the decision, Oberlander fled to Florida, where he owned an apartment. However, agents from the U.S. Office of Special Investigations pressured him with possible deportation charges if he did not leave the country. After 2 weeks, he returned to Canada. In 2000, Judge Andrew McKay determined that there was no evidence proving Oberlander's direct or indirect involvement in the murders, and he was therefore exonerated of criminal responsibility. However, he was heavily criticized for withholding his war record from the 1953 immigration interview. Based on this withholding, the Canadian government announced it would revoke his citizenship. In response, the German-Canadian Congress and the Ukrainian-Canadian Civil Liberties Association publicly lobbied, claiming there was no conclusive evidence to justify such a decision. Finally, in 2008, Oberlander's citizenship was revoked. However, a year later, the Federal Court of Appeal overturned this measure, restoring his citizenship. The Canadian government pressed the case and in July 2017 filed an order in council. marking the fourth attempt to strip him of his citizenship. In 2018, Federal Court Justice Michael Phelan ruled that the revocation was lawful. Knowing that his extradition to Germany would mean facing criminal prosecution for war crimes, Oberlander filed a new appeal. However, the Federal Court of Appeal denied his request to reopen the case, dismissing arguments alleging bias by Justice Phelan in 2008. On December 5, 2019, the Supreme Court of Canada refused to grant Helmut Oberlander leave to appeal the federal court's decision, definitively paving the way for his deportation. In February 2020, Oberlander was still living in Ontario and filed a new appeal, but in October of that same year, he also lost his right to appeal to the Immigration and Refugee Board, which led to the opening of a formal deportation hearing. In April 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada rejected his legal team's final attempt to halt the proceedings. However, the court proceedings dragged on, and finally, on September 20, 2021, Helmut Oberlander died in Ontario at the age of 97. Alois Brunner was born on April 8, 1912, in a small village called Nagykút, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. During his adolescence, he studied accounting and began working as a salesman. In 1931, he joined the National Socialist Party and joined the Sturmabteilung SA, the Nazi paramilitary organization known as the Brown Shirts. This militancy caused him problems at his job at a department store, and he was eventually fired. After the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria in 1938, Brunner joined the Schutzstaffel, SS, in Vienna, where he became part of Section 4B4 of the Gestapo, led by Adolf Eichmann. He participated in the planning of the so-called Nisko Plan, a failed project to establish a Jewish reservation in occupied Poland in 1939. Although his formal rank was Hauptsturmführer, his actual role within the SS was to resolve operational problems related to deportations. Under this responsibility, Brunner coordinated the expulsion of thousands of Jews from Vichy France and Slovakia to Nazi concentration camps. In February 1942, Brunner acted as commander of a convoy of deportees from Vienna to Riga. During the journey, he shot and killed several prisoners, including the financier Zygmunt Bosel, who, despite being seriously ill, had been forcibly removed from a Viennese hospital. In June 1943, he organized the deportation of 43,000 Jews from Vienna and another 46,000 from Salonika, Greece. Shortly after, he was appointed commandant of the Drancy internment camp in Paris, the nerve center of the deportation of French Jews. In 1944, Eichmann ordered Brunner transferred to Slovakia, where he oversaw the shipment of thousands of Jews to the camps of Theresienstadt, Sachsenhausen, Bergen-Belsen, and Stutthof. Most of these deportees perished, and the few survivors were later transferred to Auschwitz, where they were finally exterminated. After the fall of the Third Reich, Brunner managed to escape from Soviet and Allied troops. In a 1985 interview with Bunte magazine, he explained that during the first months of post-war chaos, his identity was mistaken for that of another SS member, Anton Brunner, who was in fact executed for war crimes. This exchange of identities not only fooled Allied authorities, but also several historians. Alois Brunner claimed to have received false documents from American officials and that he worked for a time as a driver for the American Occupation Army. He was later employed by the Gehlen Organization, the intelligence agency created by the Americans in Germany, to recruit former Nazi soldiers for strategic purposes during the Cold War. In 1954, he fled West Germany using a false passport provided by the International Red Cross. He first traveled to Rome, then moved to Egypt, where he became involved in arms trafficking. Finally, he took refuge in Syria, where he adopted the identity of Dr. Georg Fischer. There he was hired by a Syrian government advisor in roles that have not been fully clarified. However, several experts agree that Brunner used his knowledge acquired in the Gestapo to serve the Syrian regime, instructing its security forces in techniques of repression and torture. Alois Brunner is believed to have actively collaborated with dictator Hafez al-Assad in the creation of an unprecedented repressive system in Syria, the central purpose of which was to control the country through a reign of absolute terror. According to the anonymous testimony of an opposition activist, this apparatus of fear managed to terrify citizens from cradle to grave, generating a constant state of paranoia. The stories of repression were numerous. Groups of high school students removed from their classrooms without explanation. Young people detained for visiting relatives in insurgent-controlled areas, entire families arrested for sharing food with their neighbors, and such atrocious cases as that of a 13-year-old boy detained and tortured to death simply for walking down a street near an anti-government demonstration. For decades, Syria managed to block access to Western researchers such as Serge Klarsfeld, Kurt Schrimm and Simon Wiesenthal, who had made efforts to locate and bring Brunner to trial. Between 1961 and 1980, Brunner received several parcel bombs at his residence in Damascus. One caused the loss of an eye, and another blew off the fingers on his left hand. Although the perpetrator of these attacks was never officially confirmed, many believe they were covert operations by Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service. In the late 1980s, senior officials of the German Democratic Republic reached an agreement with the Syrian government to secure Brunner's extradition and arrest. However, the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 led to the collapse of the German communist regime and definitively thwarted that plan. In 1995, German prosecutors in Cologne and Frankfurt offered a reward of over 300,000 German marks to anyone who could provide reliable information leading to his capture. However, in 1999, German authorities received discouraging news. Brunner had died in 1996 and was supposedly buried in a Damascus cemetery. Despite this version, the German press denied it, stating that several journalists had seen him in subsequent years at the Méridien Hotel in Damascus, where he was said to be living under the protection of the Syrian regime. In late 2001, other reporters even confirmed his presence at the same hotel complex. In 2011, the German magazine Der Spiegel revealed that the German Federal Intelligence Service, BND, had destroyed all its files on Brunner during the 1990s, further hampering efforts to arrest him. Other sources maintain that he died in 2001 in a Damascus cell, in total isolation and ironically subjected to the same torture methods he had taught decades earlier. Oskar Gröning was born in 1921 in the Free State of Prussia. From childhood, he was raised in an environment of ironic discipline and nationalism. He first joined the Steel Helmet's youth organization and later, in 1923, joined the Hitler Youth, where he found an environment that reinforced the ideology he had already imbued at home. Influenced by these ideas, he soon came to the conviction that Nazism was the best path for Germany. He sincerely believed that the movement was made up of people willing to do whatever was necessary to ensure the progress of their nation. With this conviction in mind, he participated in public burnings of books written by Jewish authors and other intellectuals the regime considered degenerate. Gröning was convinced that his work was essential to freeing the country from aberrant foreign influences and also that National Socialism would improve the economy by reducing unemployment. While strengthening his political commitment, he completed his schooling with outstanding grades. At 17, he began an apprenticeship as a bank clerk. However, a few months into his career, war broke out. Many of the bank's employees were called up, and Gröning, still an apprentice, took advantage of this opportunity to take on more responsibilities. Germany's swift victories in France and Poland convinced him that he should contribute more directly to the war effort. In 1942, he left his accounting position when the SS dictated that office work would be reserved for wounded veterans and that those in good physical condition should take on more active roles. Transferred to the SS financial offices in Berlin, he received strict orders not to reveal the content of his work to anyone, not even his family or friends. Shortly thereafter, he was sent to Katowice, Poland, where he was to report to the commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Until then, Gröning had no idea of the camp's existence. Upon arrival, he and other new members were welcomed into a hall with abundant food. While they were eating, an officer burst in shouting "Transport," and several men immediately left the hall. The next day, due to his banking experience, Gröning was assigned to the barracks where money confiscated from prisoners was stored. At first, he was told that these sums would be kept until the detainees were released, but he soon discovered that they would never be returned and that Auschwitz was an extermination camp. It was then that he understood the meaning of the cry "transport." His job was to count and sort money, and also to guard the belongings of the new arrivals during the selection process. While his position did not involve deciding who would die, his role required him to witness horrific scenes. He saw children shot and people unable to walk humiliated and mercilessly executed. On one occasion, he witnessed a Jewish woman hide her baby in rags on the floor before being led to the gas chamber. Shortly after, a soldier, disturbed by the child's crying, grabbed the baby by the legs and bludgeoned him to death. The scene made a profound impression on him, so much so that he requested a transfer. He argued before his superior that if the extermination of the Jews was necessary, it should at least be done within certain limits. His request was rejected. After other similar experiences, he again demanded to be assigned elsewhere, but his superior reminded him that he had signed a declaration of confidentiality and commitment. From then on, Gröning tried to stay away from the areas where the crimes were taking place, although he could not erase the atrocities he witnessed from his memory. Finally, Gröning achieved his goal and in 1944 was assigned to the Western Front, where he participated in the Battle of the Bulge. During the fighting, he was wounded and taken to a field hospital. After recovering, he rejoined his unit, which surrendered to British forces on June 10, 1945. Once a prisoner of war, Gröning decided to conceal his experience at Auschwitz and simply stated that he had worked in the SS economic offices. He and several of his comrades were held in a former Nazi concentration camp, which now served as a prison. In 1946, he was sent to England as a forced labourer. Despite his prisoner status, his life there was quite comfortable. He was well fed, earned money working in Scotland and the Midlands, and even sang German hymns and English folk songs. In 1947, he returned to Germany. He asked his wife never to ask him where he had been. He was unable to regain his position at the bank due to his SS past, but managed to get a job at a glass factory. There, he rose through the ranks, first to an administrative position, then to head of personnel, and finally to honorary judge of the labor court. At a family gathering, some relatives accused him of having been a murderer, or at least an accomplice to murder, for his participation in Auschwitz. Gröning reacted furiously. He banged his fist on the table and declared that word and that connection must never be mentioned again in his presence, warning that if he persisted, he would leave the house. Sometime later, Gröning came into contact with Thies Christophersen, a German editor and publicist who denied the Holocaust. It was then that he confessed, "I saw everything. The gas chambers, the cremations, the selections on the ramp. 1.5 million Jews were murdered at Auschwitz. I was there." His statements were published in a neo-Nazi magazine which twisted his words to claim that what Gröning was describing were hallucinations. From that moment on, he began receiving threatening phone calls and letters. Faced with this situation, he decided to come forward and publicly denounce those who accused him of lying. "Believe me, I saw the gas chambers, I saw the crematoria, I saw the cooking stoves. I was on the ramp when the selections were made. I wish they would believe me. Those atrocities happened, I was there." He also wrote an 87-page manuscript of his memoirs, which he wrote exclusively for his family. On April 21, 2015, a trial began in Lüneburg, Lower Saxony, where he was accused of being an accomplice to the murder of at least 300,000 Jews at Auschwitz. On June 15th of that same year, the court found him guilty and sentenced him to 4 years in prison. However, before serving his sentence on March 12, 2018, Oskar Gröning died at the age of 96. Such was the fate of many SS men after World War II.